Welcome in to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. A podcast dedicated to everything you need to know about the squad. Hear from players, coaches, broadcasters, and those who cover the NBA on a daily basis. It's time to flock up. The New Orleans Pelicans Podcast starts right now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, your official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. Mr. Jim Eichenhofer, Pelicans.com, Gus Kattengell with you. Oh, man, what a performance by the Pels last night, in particular one player, a big player. You might have heard of him, Zion Williamson.
Zion Williamson drives in hard, missed it, got it back, and rams it in again.
Oh, no, he didn't.
Trey to McCollum, bounce feed to the cutting. Z! Double clutch, two-hand flush from the right baseline.
Thunder Z. Great pass by CJ, and Z riding the baseline with a smile on his face with the punch.
Now outlawing Trey Murphy.
Z wants it back.
And they feed it down low. He catches it and lays it in and one. That is a great pass from Daniel Tice.
It was a late feed because Z had him sealed earlier. He couldn't get it to him, and after Z gives up the post, Tice throws the lob anyway, and Z comes down with it.
And Patrick Williams has sparks.
21 points in 24 minutes for him, 9 assists, 7 rebounds. Trey Murphy had 32 points. Both of those players really stood out. 119-113 was the win. Head coach Willie Green had this to say first on Z.
He's incredible. When he touches the floor, everything gets better. And you can feel his energy, you can feel his gravity. Like you said, in 23 minutes, 21 points, 9 assists, 7 rebounds. That's incredible. And it's great to have him on the floor with our guys.
And we just talked about it on Monday's podcast, and here's Coach on Trey Murphy.
Yeah, Trey was still aggressive, even though he didn't shoot the three ball as well as we know he's capable of. And the 12 free throws right away, it jumps out to you. It allows you to look at his production on the floor and know that he was attacking the basket. He was getting to the basket, finishing. And then when he didn't have anything, he did a great job of just swinging it to a teammate and allowing other guys to create in space.
The road trip that took the team to Philly, Boston, and Chicago. We were together on Friday at that Loft 18 official watch party. We watched what happened the last 2 games there as well. Am I off my rocker, Jim, in saying that was probably the best 3-game stretch the Pels have played this season?
Yeah, and in fact, when I sit down with John DeShazier, he's going to say the same sentiment, so he agrees with you as well. I mean, this last stretch to me has been kind of a breath of fresh air based on comparative to how the rest of the season has gone. I mean, they've picked up multiple road wins in January. They had 2 on the road trip, almost had 3. Before that, they only had 1 road win. They've won 4 out of their last 7 games. Before that, they were 5-29. So I mean, they almost have as many wins since January 3rd as they had in the first 3 months of the season. So I mean, just across the board, this is just so much more entertaining, competitive basketball, and just being able to see the talent come through that we know is there, and we've just been waiting on to deliver, better basketball and more wins. It's been fun to watch what they've done lately, and looking forward to seeing what more they can add over this next 4-game homestand.
You and JD are going to get into specifics and some things about some of these players, but I had to do this for you. I literally almost saved this highlight last night in the Smoothie King Center studios as Jim's highlight of the night.
Shovels to Jose.
Why not?
Why not? Why not?
Why not?
Left wing deep and down.
You got threes raining in the United Center.
How about that?
Typical Jose Alvarado. He hadn't scored in the first 3 quarters. Not that you look for scoring as a big element of what he does, but then he makes 4 3-pointers in the fourth quarter, all huge. I feel like he's done that on the road before. I remember the playoff series against Phoenix a couple of years ago. He had a game or 2 where he didn't score, and then in the fourth quarter, all of a sudden, he's the guy that's taking and making the biggest 3-pointers of the night. So that was what he did again against the Bulls.
And look, if people don't know, and they should by now, you love you some Jose Alvarado. You think his element to what he brings to this team, not only on the defensive end, but you see it on the offensive end, I don't think it's coincidental. Since his return, his team's played harder, they've played more competitive, and they've played really well. Listen to Z.
That's Jose. Jose's live any night to go for 30, to run off 5, 8 threes. Jose is such a unique player where he can influence the game. Some games in scoring, some games he might could have 5 points, but his impact on the overall game was huge because of how he played defense, picking up full court, just being a pest on the offensive players, or just his energy in general.
Yeah, I mean, we just repeatedly see the impact that he makes on the team overall. Can I explain all of the reasons why? No. But, I mean, it's easy if you just look at the numbers.
Right.
I mean, I hadn't even really looked at it that closely in terms of this season. But, I mean, all of the stuff I mentioned a second ago about, their record since January 3rd, how they've gotten more road wins lately. I mean, he did come back on January 3rd, which I didn't even realize until I just started looking at his game log. So it is funny how it's like everything syncs up to when he's available. And I'm not going to look at it yet, but I'm sure maybe a few weeks from now, hopefully they'll pile up some more wins and the numbers of with Jose and without Jose get even more drastic and just show the difference that he makes.
We're going to talk with JD here in a quick second, but give me 30 seconds because in segment 3 yesterday, in our Pelicans warm-up, our pregame show, you mentioned, hey, that Sunday was the first time we got to see Trey, Zion, and DeJounte Murray play together this season. Second game in, 32 for Trey, 21 for Zion with 9 assists, 7 assists from DeJounte Murray. If I do the math correctly here, let's see, 20 assists between Trey, Zion, and DeJounte. What does that tell you about those three?
Yeah, I mean, once again, we saw some really good basketball from them, from the combination of players. I mean, Pelicans were +7 with Zion on the court. Surprisingly, they only broke even with Trey, and they were -9 with DeJounte, but nonetheless, just those three guys continue to show the combination and makes you really excited for the rest of the season as well as down the road.
That's crazy when you think of this, too. 32 points for Trey Murphy, and he only hit 2 threes. That tells you the evolution of his game, huh?
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to get into this as well with JD. He was perfect from the free throw line and perfect on 2-pointers. We don't usually think of Trey Murphy as a guy who scores in the paint, but increasingly we are. We're seeing him take some little hook shots, 5-6 feet from the basket. We're seeing him put the ball on the floor and just dunk on people. So just the diversification, well, that's a big word, of his game is impressive. And, I mean, he's had 2 games in a row of 30-plus points. I thought maybe that was the first time in his career that he did that, but actually at the end of the season 2 years ago, he had a couple games that were 30-plus. So, I mean, it's at the point where we're not surprised. I mean, before – he's had a couple huge games where he had a 40-something game against Portland, and it was like, man, what a night for Trey Murphy. But I feel like now when he's getting 25, 30 points, it's just kind of ho-hum. This is what he does now. So just been really impressive.
Yeah, it's kind of cool to see him grow as a player. All right, that conversation with Mr. John DeShazier, analyst on the Pelicans radio network, starts now.
Welcome back to the Pelicans Podcast. I'm here with John DeShazier. John, later this week we're going to have a radio roundtable. I guess this is going to be kind of our writer roundtable. Just two old school newspaper guys.
Ink-stained record.
Yes, exactly. We're not going to get into the future or the present of newspapers. We're going to talk about the Pelicans road trip. That was really why we wanted to have you on today. Was you were obviously at all 3 of the games on the road trip. I mean, first of all, I guess from kind of a big picture standpoint, how do you describe maybe the feeling of what it was like going into this road trip and now the overall feeling about the team afterwards? It just seems like obviously there was a lot of positive things that happened.
Well, you go in and there's a huge unknown because one, the team, wasn't playing well, and 2, the first thing that hits you in the face, smacks you in the face on the road trip is Zion Williamson suspended and Herb Jones is going to be out, and then it's like, okay, so you got those 2. And Trey Murphy's not going to play in that first game, and you already don't have Brandon Ingram. So that's 4 of your top 6 players who won't be playing in the first game on the road trip, and it's like, okay, what else can go wrong? So for the team to go out and win that game at Philadelphia, which was phenomenal considering who was missing, and then to actually play well again in Boston, come within a bucket at the buzzer of beating Boston in Boston, and then to go and hold on against Chicago on the road. I thought it was, for me, probably the best 3 games I've seen this team play stretched together back to back to back this season. And so now it's like, okay, this is what this team is supposed to look like. This is what it can look like. Even though you still don't have Herb Jones and Brandon Ingram, this is what this team can look like when these guys play hard and when you get them on the court, because, a lot of it's got to do with health, but you finally get those guys on the court together, and the chemistry probably still isn't what you want it to be if you're the Pelicans, but only 9 turnovers against Chicago in the last game on the road trip. That's phenomenal for any venue against any opponent. Mm-hmm. And then, again, there were 5-game leads against Boston down the stretch, 5-point leads by Boston down the stretch that the Pels were able to overcome, 2 or 3 times in that game. And then Chicago took a couple of 7-point leads down the stretch, and they were able to overcome that. So those are the things that gives you some hope, and those are the things you look at and say, you know what, this team, man, I know they're, 20 games under 500, but boy, if they can get healthy, they might not get to the play-in, but this is kind of a future look at what the Pels can be.
Along similar lines, from a big picture standpoint, I know a couple of the players have talked about this recently. I heard Jose Alvarado talk about it after the Chicago game last night, that he said, we know our record still isn't what we want it to be, and even, he didn't say this, I'm adding this, my own take to this, but, even a long winning streak, they still won't be in a good position. But, does the road trip, the way that they played on these 3 games, does it change maybe not necessarily the long term or the major outlook for the team, but what you expect from them and what you think that they can accomplish either in this next stretch of games or even over the last 41 games of the regular season?
Oh, absolutely. Because now you look at it and you say, okay, they're 9-32. You don't say, okay, they're going to be 32-9 over the next stretch, but you say, you know what, okay, this team is competitive, this team is good, and this team is going to put itself in position to win games. And now it looks like this team might actually know how to win those games down the stretch, because you had that situation in Chicago and you had that situation in Boston where, but for, a bank shot not going in, you win that game. So you look at that. If you're the Pelicans, you have to look inward and say, okay, this is what we've been thinking that we can be. And so now we're seeing the hard work pay off. If you're a fan, 9-32 is 9-32. You are what your record says you are. 9-32 is 9-32. But you can look at this team now and say, you know what? That's an entertaining team. That's a team that I can kind of get behind and watch that team, because, that team might not get to the playoffs, but man, that team's got some hope and some something that you can project into the future. And that's kind of what we're looking at now, because, things went so much sideways with the injuries to where, the reality is what it is. But now you look at it and say, okay, I can see why they were so optimistic about this team, because this team, can play not just good basketball, really good basketball, and they can take it and travel with it, which is huge in the NBA.
Speaking of entertaining basketball, what has stood out to you the most about what Zion's done in the first 3 games that he's played since he came back from his hamstring injury? Played against Minnesota, was a really tight game, and then played these last 2 games on the road trip, 1-point loss to Boston, and then Chicago win last night.
He's still that dude. He's still that dude who's got, you hear Willie Green talk about it all the time, that gravitational pull, where when he's got the ball, all eyes are on Z. And if you're smart, and if he's the Zion Williamson we're accustomed to seeing, you have to double him. You gotta send extra help if you're the opponent to help on him. And we saw that in Chicago, and where, first he was cooking Patrick Williams. Mm-hmm. So then they say, okay, Patrick, you can't handle him by yourself. They send the double teams, and Z makes the right pass, and his teammates make it right, and they make some threes. So then Chicago says, okay, we're going to put Vucevic on him. We're going to put the 7-footer on him and see what he can do. And then he immediately takes him and gets an and-1. It's one of those things where when he's present physically and when he's right mentally and he's on the court, he causes so much havoc for an opponent. And he is such an advantage, especially when you got shooters around him. When you got C.J. McCollum and Trey Murphy, and you got Jose Alvarado making threes. When you got guys out there who are making shots around him and make you pay for the double team, he is such a weapon, because, there are very few guys in the NBA like Zion Williamson that you absolutely, when he's right, you got to double him. Mm-hmm. You got to. Otherwise, he's just going to have his way. You got to set up special defenses for him. We've seen teams set up, that that basically hockey line, that picket fence against him. And if he's got people who around him who make shots, well, you make that obsolete because you're giving away threes instead of the twos that he's going to make. And so now all of a sudden you got to come out of that. So to see him on the road trip, especially in the Chicago game, and now you're seeing it on his face where he's saying, I understand I'm on minutes restriction, but man, I need to play because I'm kicking people's tail and I feel good. And so just let me loose. So I'm looking forward to the point where he gets from, 27, 28 minutes to 35 minutes because he's working people and there's not a whole lot they can do about it when he's right.
You mentioned the shooting around Zion. It was interesting because Trey Murphy on Tuesday against Chicago actually had a poor shooting game from three-point range for him. I mean, he's been one of the best three-point shooters in the league lately, but he still gets the 32 points. I mean, what are you seeing from him lately in terms of his progression? It seems like he's kind of taking that next step as a player.
I'll tell you what, the most impressive thing to me in that Chicago game was that he was 2 of 13 from three. Mm-hmm. Not because he was 2 of 13, obviously that's not impressive, but he kept shooting the three because he was wide open. He was taking his looks. And 2, the 32 points tells you that he found other ways to score, sure, which is where his game needed to evolve to. Now he's on the dribble drive and he's drawing fouls. And if he's a 90% free throw shooter, that's almost automatic. So you like to see that aggression with him and the recognition of I'm big and strong enough now. I've worked on my game. I'm confident enough to where I can get around guys. And if I get around guys, I can get to the rim and either I can get to the rim and finish, I can get to the rim and get fouled and get to the free throw line. He shoots, 12 free throws in that game, makes all 12 of them. But, again, for Trey Murphy to attempt 12 free throws in a game, and I think that matched his career high in attempts in a game.
Yeah, I'd have to look. It could be.
I know he just had a game where he had 11 attempts, and that was the second most. So that's got to be either it's 13 or 12. So that might match his attempts, high. That shows the aggression and him saying, okay, I'm going to still take these threes, and they're still going to challenge me on these threes. But when they do, I'm going to periodically get around these guys judiciously and get into the lane and finish or get the free throws. And I love to see that out of his game because you don't know what a guy is until you see him adding to his game in the NBA. He comes in and he's got a particular skill, and you say, okay, what can he become? What can he round into? Well, this is what Trey Murphy is rounding into, and there's more.
Yeah. It was funny yesterday. I looked up. I had noticed that he had a stretch of a bunch of games in a row where he hadn't missed a free throw. I mean, I guess to cut to the chase, he does have the franchise record now he's made 43 free throws in a row. That was something I didn't want to mention to Graf because he would have yelled at me for potentially cursing Trey and causing a miss. But it was funny because I want to apologize to Trey Murphy because yesterday I looked up that he had made 31 in a row, and I asked, what's the franchise record? And I was told it was 42. And my text message back to that was, oh, he could get that in the next 2 or 3 games. He could break. It only ended up taking him 1 game to do it. So I'm glad that I noticed that yesterday because otherwise we might not have found out that he's actually now the franchise record holder for most consecutive free throws. So Trey Murphy, excellent job making 12 in 1 game, greatly surpassing my expectations of how long it was going to take you to break that record. But that was just kind of funny that it just kind of shows he's doing a lot of things I think that are past what we expect of him.
He's doing stuff that his first and second year I wouldn't have dreamed of. I was like, in his rookie year, I was like, well, he's going to have to not just be a 3-point shooter. He's going to have to learn to put it on the floor a little bit better and get to the rim, and hopefully that'll. But now it's like he has blossomed into this dude to where, he goes down and he's got some fearlessness to him, and he's got that athleticism, and when he gets to the rim, he gets a clear path. Folks are getting out of the way because 1, they don't want to be on SportsCenter. They don't want to be posterized, and 2, he's getting to the point where he can finish through contact, or if not, he'll just go to the free throw line and make 2 free throws. So, it's great to see where he's come from.
Sure. And by the way, last night, not only was he 12 for 12 on his free throws, but he was also 7 for 7 on 2-point shots. So a perfect night for Trey other than the 3-point shooting. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back with JD. A couple quick other things I wanted to go through with you. DeJounte Murray. Antonio Daniels was on the show last week, and he talked about, we asked him, What's the biggest thing that DeJounte needed to get back to looking like the player that we remember when he used to do damage against the Pelicans when he played for the Spurs and then his couple years for Atlanta? And AD basically said time. That was the main thing he needed, was just more time back from his injury. What stood out to you lately about the way that DeJounte has played and just how much improved he's been?
Well, he's cutting down the turnovers, which is huge for a point guard because, he's had some games where he's, had 5, 6, those kinds of numbers. It's hard to win for a team when the point guard has that many turnovers because he's the guy who's handling the rock and protecting it. But I've seen the efficiency in the shooting go up also from three-point range especially. I don't know if he's never been a great quote-unquote shooter.
Sure, yeah,
but
average.
He is really good at just making winning plays. The steals, the rebounds, the deflections, the defense where, he doesn't block a shot, but he forces the guy into a miss. And now he's handling, without Herb Jones, he's taking the toughest defensive assignments. He was the guy, for the most part, trying to guard Jason Tatum. He was the guy against, Zach LaVine. He was the guy who's, kind of chasing around a little bit, of Tyrese Maxey. He's assuming those responsibilities, and he looks eager to do it. I mean, he's played against these guys before, and, you look at him and, DeJounte Murray, he's a skinny dude, but he's not backing down from anybody defensively. He's got that, you always see these dudes on, they got that dog in them. Everybody says that. It ain't a whole lot of dudes who actually have it in them. He looks like one of those dudes who has it in him to where he's like, I don't care who this dude is, I'm going to guard him, and I'm going to make it tough for him. And yeah, he might end up with, 28 or 30 or whatever it is, but he's going to know he had to work for it. And that's the thing you like to see, especially you got to have it when you don't have Herb Jones because, now you're taking away a first-team All-NBA defender in Herb Jones. So who's going to step up and make those plays that make his teammates say, you know what, if he's playing that way, I got to play that way. We saw Zion get 5 steals in Boston. 5. Career high. But, I mean, Z was, like, all over the place. And then against Chicago, he was all over the place again. He didn't have any steals, but, I mean, he was just all over the place. And you see these guys looking inspired defensively, at stretches during the game where, the opponents make shots. This is the NBA. Dudes make shots. This is the league. But you see this team continuing to buckle down when they go down 7. They're still saying, okay, we if we get a couple of stops, we're right here. If they go down 5, if we get a couple of stops, we're right there. So it's great to see, and I love to see that out of him, leading the team defensively and being more efficient offensively, not shooting percentage-wise, just being more efficient in terms of protecting the basketball and making sure you get into the offense and you get the shots you want.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think around the NBA we see some dogs. We see some people that have a lot of bark and not a lot of bite. I'm not going to name names, but yeah, I think that's definitely the case. Last thing with you, JD, as we record this, we don't know the status for really for players on both teams, with this being the second game of a back-to-back tonight with the Mavericks. Kyrie Irving came back last night from being injured, but obviously not sure about his status as well. So I don't want to get too detailed into this game because we're going to get more information when the injury report comes out before 1 o'clock. However, I did want to ask you, would you rather play an 8:30 game in Dallas and then come to New Orleans, or would you rather play a 7 o'clock game in Chicago and then have to come to New Orleans? Because both of these teams are in situations where they had to travel to get back here to the Crescent City.
Probably Dallas because it's still quicker. I think they probably got here.
Flight.
Yeah, I think it's a shorter flight. I think they probably got here before we did. So probably Dallas. But that said, the Pels are a lot more whole. And say for instance, it's a back-to-back and Zion doesn't play because you're still kind of, monitoring his situation with the hamstring. But you still got Trey Murphy. You still got DeJounte Murray. You still got CJ. And CJ McCollum has shined most, it seems, when Zion Williamson hadn't been on the floor.
Right.
Because he's taken that extra responsibility. He's gone, his responsibilities have increased in those situations, and that's when he's been at his best. And then, you got the secret weapon of Jordan Hawkins. When he starts, dude scores 20.
True. He loves Dallas too.
Yeah,
he loves playing against the Mavericks.
When he starts, he scores 20. I mean, you can almost write it down. So, the Pelicans, they might not be whole, but man, they just look so much better because they have gotten healthy and they have gotten guys back on the court. And even if, a couple of guys aren't playing, I think they've kind of figured it out how to play better. But, long-winded answer that I'm going to try to get back to, I'd rather play than Dallas.
Well, we're looking forward to this game tonight. I mean, regardless of the status of different players. It's disappointing on one hand that we're not going to see Luka Doncic, but on the other hand, with the abuse that he's handed out to the Pelicans in recent years, I guess I'm okay with him sitting this one out.
And we ain't got to look at him whining the whole game. He's a phenomenal player, but we don't have to look at him whining the whole game.
That's true. The refs are probably okay with him not being on the floor.
I'm not going to miss that.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks, JD, and back to you, Gus.
Our thanks to JD and Jim for giving us the insight there. That's why do I feel like you guys could have gone like 3 hours of here's a stat, here's a thought, here's a stat, here's a thought.
We definitely could have, and maybe in a future podcast I referenced this at the beginning when I talked to JD. We'll discuss newspapers because both of us are veterans of the newspaper industry. But for our audience here, it was probably better that we stuck to just Pelicans.
I hear you.
All right, y'all. Now it's time for Western Conference Wednesday. Mr. Eichenhofer will tell us whose stock is up and whose stock is down. So let's get started. Jim, what is our team to keep an eye on for this week?
Well, the team to watch over the next 7 days is the Minnesota Timberwolves. I mean, there's a bunch of teams that I think are in interesting positions right now with the West standings being so compressed where you lose a few games and you can drop a few spots. You win a few games and you might move up 1 or 2 places in the standings. But I picked the Timberwolves in particular because their schedule coming up is really compelling. They play Golden State tonight on ESPN. They're at the Knicks on Friday. They're home against Cleveland Saturday, and then they're at Memphis on Monday. So right now the Timberwolves are 21-18, which is 8th place in the West. But the combination of Warriors, Knicks, Cavs, Grizzlies, that's about as tough of a stretch I think of any team has in the NBA, not just the Western Conference, over the next week. And by the way, the Pelicans still have 2 games left against the Timberwolves. They're March 19th and 21st in Minneapolis. The latter of those 2 games is on ESPN, so something to look forward to later in the season. Excuse me. As far as stock up and down goes, stock up, I went with the Denver Nuggets, who, I mean, they're the most notable thing to me about their position that they're in right now is they've played so well lately. They're 8-2 out of their last 10 games. They've won 4 games in a row. They've played so well that they now have a 2.5 lead in 4th place of the West. So they actually are getting more and more comfortable as a top 4 seed. I think that's something that would have been a big question mark a few weeks ago, but they've played such good basketball. Russell Westbrook has moved into the starting lineup, and they are constantly winning games. They just swept the Mavericks in a baseball series, the latter of which Kyrie Irving did play in the game last night. Obviously, Luka Doncic hasn't played in either of those games. But either way, I mean, the Nuggets have greatly improved their position in the conference standings. Pelicans have 2 games. This I didn't plan it this way, but it's just kind of coincidental. The Pelicans also have a baseball series left against Denver, just like they do with Minnesota. The one in Denver with the Pelicans is February 3rd and 5th. The latter of those 2 games is scheduled to be an ESPN national TV game, just like the latter game against the Timberwolves in that March series. And then stock down, again, this is a team that the Pelicans have a road baseball series left. The Phoenix Suns, the Pelicans play them February 27th and 28th in Phoenix. The first of those 2 games is scheduled to be a TNT game. So once again, a game that's going to be on the national airways. I have to mention, it did seem like not that long ago you might have thought some of these games might get bumped from national TV, but the way the Pelicans are playing now and with Zion back, I think you might see these games solidified as games that are carried on those networks. But I picked the Phoenix Suns as stock down because they're actually now in 11th place in the West. They're 19-20. I mean, that's far below the expectations I think everyone had for them going into the season, especially a team, as we all know, that has Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, Bradley Beal. They just have been struggling. They've lost 6 out of their last 10 games. They're in a position where even just getting into the play-in tournament is not a lock. I think Golden State is in a similar position where it's a team that has at least one and maybe multiple stars but is struggling to be a top 10 squad. So Phoenix Suns, that's the stock down this week. And Timberwolves, Nuggets, Suns, all three of those teams, the Pelicans still have 2 games left against them, all of them on the road.
Should be fun. As always, Mr. Jim Eichenhofer, appreciate the time. We'll hear from you later on this evening in Pelicans OT, hopefully speaking about another Pelicans win.
That would be great, Gus.
That would be very good. Our thanks to John DeShazier again, and thank you for tuning us in on the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. See you on Friday.
Thanks for listening to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast. Join us 3 times per week on Pelicans.com, the Pelicans mobile app, the iHeartRadio app, or where you get your podcast. And be sure to give Jim and Gus a follow on X at Jim_Eichenhofer and GCat_17. We'll see you next time, right here on the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast.